So welcome to my webinar on Indigenous Women, Law and Environment. This webinar has been organized by me and Impactr, whom I'm very thankful to for asking me to present you this topic. So let me tell you something about Impactr before we proceed with the webinar. About Impactr. Impactr is a global company on a mission to make sustainability mainstream and convert everyone in the world to make a change. Impactr has an app, the Impactr app, to make sustainability action just as easy as liking a post on Twitter. It also has the Impactr Storms, which is a very cool platform for global campaigns that accelerate the transition to sustainability. For instance, the campaign you can see here, Flick the Switch, is a campaign that is aimed at making people switch their electricity provider. And then there's also Impactr TV, which is a storytelling platform to make data and information more relatable. And this webinar in particular will also be available on Impactr TV. Of course, many of you probably know about the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In order to create a pathway for urgent inclusive action, 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, have been brought together in one framework as an indivisible and universal whole. Therefore, there are not only goals and targets, but also the interactions among them that are brought into focus in the 2030 Agenda. And particularly, the SDG of March, according to the 2020 calendar for the agenda, is gender equality. And this is the reason why we decided to do this webinar today. So this webinar is presented by me. I'm Federica Catonini. I'm an international environmental law and law of the sea specialist. This is my background. And this is also the reason why I thought it would be interesting to talk about the relationship between Indigenous women and the legal system, and also the role that Indigenous women have in environmental protection. So let me start with, why do we talk about Indigenous women? So according to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, there should be an opportunity to promote the rights and the well-being of Indigenous people. And according to SDG 5, the goal is to achieve the gender equality and empower all women and girls. However, it is a particularly complex challenge for Indigenous women because these women are among the most marginalized and discriminated women on the planet. And this is also the reason why I decided to talk about them. I decided to talk about them on the one side because of their marginalization, but on the other side also because Indigenous women are a great example of environmental activism and respect for nature. I prepared a poll for you that I will launch right now. And I would like you to answer before I proceed, because I'm gonna talk to you about Indigenous people very briefly, and I wanna know what do you think. According to the UN, Indigenous people help to protect an estimated 80% of the planet biodiversity, 50% of the planet, 35 or 65. You can answer now before I proceed. And I'll share with you the results now. So according to the UN, Indigenous people help protect an estimated 80% of the planet biodiversity. This was really, really surprising even for me, even if I knew that Indigenous people are extremely important for the protection of the environment, but I was really impressed to see this percentage. So let's proceed with the presentation. So who are Indigenous people though? According to the principle of self-attribution and identification, Indigenous people, an Indigenous person is somebody acknowledged by his or her community as such, and will consider himself or herself as an Indigenous person. So there isn't really a definition of Indigenous people. But I'll give you some data to understand why it is so relevant to talk about Indigenous people in connection with environmental protection. So according to the World Bank, there are approximately, as you can see here in this image, 360 and 70 million Indigenous people worldwide. They are distributed in over 90 countries and are present in all continents. Indigenous people are also 5% of the global population and account for about 15% of the extreme poor. In fact, indigenous people, also due to their marginalization, are subject to numerous human rights violations, and they often see their land expropriated. Indigenous people are extremely tied to their land. I wrote down this sentence from a judge of the International Court of Justice because I thought that it really embodies what is the land for indigenous people. I'm gonna read it to you. The hills of their lands were sacred to them, being the place where they render tribute and respect to their dead. Their lands, they insisted, belonged to them as much as they belonged to their lands. Theirs was not the language of the Homo economicus of modernity and postmodernity. Not at all. Preservation of their harmony with their natural environment was of the utmost importance to them. This sentence really shows us how important is the environment, how important is the land for indigenous people. And in fact, threatening their survival also means threatening the nature survival and contribute to important cultural loss. According to the UN, actually, indigenous people care for nearly 22% of the Earth's surface. And as I said before, living in areas as diverse as the Amazon and the Arctic, they help protect an estimated 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity. And this is also the reason why even the Paris Agreement recognizes the role of indigenous people and local communities in building resilience to climate impact. But even among indigenous people, indigenous women are those that are the most active in environmental protection and are at the same time the most discriminated and the most marginalized also among indigenous people. Indigenous women are often victims of double or even triple discrimination. This means that they are discriminated because of their gender, so because they're women, and because of their ethnicity as indigenous people, and also often due to their socioeconomic condition, which means because they're poor or because of the way they conduct their life. And indigenous women, according to the FAO, are really among the most vulnerable within indigenous communities. Even if indigenous women are actually the backbone of indigenous communities and play a crucial role in the preservation of food security, they are guardians of indigenous traditional knowledge, and they have traditionally been the carriers of natural resources and managers of seeds and medicinal plants. And also, indigenous women are often taking the lead in the defense of indigenous land, and they advocate for indigenous people's rights worldwide. When we talk about discrimination of indigenous women, we refer to several areas of discrimination, and specifically to violation of their human rights to life, to health, to social and economic rights, and also land rights. And what's interesting is also that indigenous women are often even discriminated compared to other women. I have here some data that in the US, actually, Black women earn 61 cents for every dollar earned by their white male counterparts. White women and Asian women earn 77 and 85 cents respectively, whereas Native American women earn only 58 cents to every dollar. So this shows you that, for instance, in the US, indigenous women are discriminated also compared to their female counterparts. I want to give you a little story now. I want to talk about indigenous fighters. I want to give you an example of the struggles and also the environmental activism of indigenous women. The woman you see in this picture is Gregoria Crisanta Perez, and she's an indigenous woman from Guatemala, from a small village in the north of Guatemala called San Miguel Ixtahuacan. This story was actually told to me by Eva Burnett Kempers, who's a friend and also a PhD candidate at the Animal and Law Chair at the University of Antwerp and an expert of environmental law and anthropology. Eva was in this village to do a field work a couple of years ago. And some years before, a large gold mine was built in this village. So the gold mine was actually built in the area where the Mayan populations lived. This gold mine brought some degree of economic development, of course, but at the same time, It was the symbol of a lifestyle that was really, really different from the lifestyle of the indigenous people in that area, the so-called buen vivir, which is the good living, the living in harmony with nature. And what's interesting, what Eva said, is that the reaction of the men and the women to the arrival of the mine had been drastically different. Because men saw in the construction of the mine an opportunity to earn more money and change their lifestyle into a more westernized lifestyle that eventually also led to alcoholism problems among the men community. Whereas the women had a completely different approach because they organized protests and demonstration, and they gave rise to such a big movement that this created some difficult situation even within some indigenous family. And it was really beautiful though, because the women took the role of leaders of the village, fought against this company, even if this company was now also more and more associated with their own husbands and brothers. And so what was interesting here is to see how indigenous women are really the fighters for land rights and environmental rights, even though they are considered as inferior compared to the men, even in their societies. This is not an isolated story. There are many stories of indigenous women fighters who are extremely active in climate action and are often at the forefront of both human rights battles and environmental battles. But I would like to look at what are the legal instruments, though, that we can find in the world to protect the rights of these indigenous women and these indigenous fighters. Of course, we have international instruments. For instance, the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007. This declaration was an important milestone for the protection of indigenous people worldwide. And mostly it created a sort of guideline and framework for all countries in the world to understand how important and how indigenous people should be protected. Another international legal instrument is, for instance, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention that is older from 1989, and is one of the first conventions that actually talked about the role of indigenous people and tried to give a definition of them. And then we have regional human rights instruments. The reason why this is a bigger round, it's also because regional human rights instruments are actually the instruments that are doing the most to protect indigenous people. Among these, these instruments are of course area specific. We have the Inter-American, we have the American Convention on Human Rights in the Americas, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, and we have the African Charter on Human and People Rights. Wait, I will give you another poll now. I would like to see if you guess which one of these countries has not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights, and you can give two choices here. And in the meantime, while you answer, I can continue talking about the instruments. I was saying that Europe, Americas, and Africa have charters, human rights charters. Asia has no instruments of this kind. They have a human rights declaration, which doesn't have a binding force, and they don't have a human rights court. And in Oceania, there are no regional approaches or agreements on human rights. And then, of course, we have the laws of the countries. We have national instruments like constitutions, laws, and regulations of single countries. This could be very, very potential tools, of course, for the protection of indigenous people that live in a specific country. But the problem is that there's a huge gap, there's a huge lack of these instruments in many, many countries. An exception can, for instance, be found in Bolivia, where indigenous people are actually mentioned in several sections of the 29 Bolivian constitutions, because Bolivia is one of those countries where indigenous people are considered as part of the society. So let me see the results of the poll. Okay, I'll share the results with you now. It's very interesting because actually most of you guessed that the United States of America has not ratified the American Convention on Human Rights. The other country is Canada, as you can see in the map. So yeah, as you can see in the map, the two main countries that didn't ratify the convention are actually the US and Canada. Otherwise, the other countries, you see different colors because it depends on whether or not they ratified also external protocols, additional protocols to the convention, but all these other colorful countries, they ratify the convention. So why am I talking on why am I focusing on the inter-American system? The reason for doing so is because when I thought about what should I focus on for this seminar, I thought that the inter-American system is actually the most advanced and progressive when it comes to indigenous matters. And especially it's the system that has done the most also for what concerns indigenous women rights and discrimination. This system is composed by the American Convention on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is the judicial organ that was adopted in 1969 and came into force in 1978. And it's the organ that oversees the compliance of the states with the American Convention on Human Rights. And then the third organ is the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights actually operates in all countries, so also the ones that didn't ratify the convention. And it has, like, in fact, it's based in DC. And the commission is particularly interesting when we talk about indigenous women's discrimination and rights, because they often examined the allegations of human rights violation against indigenous women, and they issued several reports and recommendations, and they tried and are fighting for raising awareness on human rights situation for indigenous women. So when we talk about indigenous women, we cannot not refer to land rights. So the right to land could perhaps seem secondary to you compared to other human rights. But this right is especially relevant because the land and the natural resources that can be found inside the land are for indigenous people, especially for women, closely tied to their cultural integrity, their spirituality, and also their traditional knowledge. And because by violating the right to land of indigenous women, we actually violate a number of other human rights. So the Commission and the Court have stated many times that the failure of the state to guarantee indigenous communities' right to their ancestral territory can impede the exercise of a range of other rights, and that the loss of land is particularly problematic for indigenous women. And this is because the indigenous women are generally recognized as the key to the continuation of their culture, the guarantors of their people's survival. Also, like by losing the land, indigenous women are basically losing their key roles in the indigenous community. And so this situation in which indigenous women find themselves with when the land is taken away from them brings also to uncertainty and often leads to situation of further discrimination and violence. Loss of land can happen for many reasons, but most of the times the land of indigenous people is expropriated by the state for some kind of development project. So for instance, for the construction of a mine or an hydroelectric plant or a dam or so on. So the Commission has also noted, interestingly, that the destruction of ancestral lands, of natural resources and sacred sites can prevent indigenous women as spiritual leaders of their communities from performing certain rituals and ceremonies. So by taking away their land, they lose their role as carers of the land, as providers of the food, of the seeds, of the medicinal plant, but also they really lose also their role as spiritual leaders of the community, thus becoming extremely discriminated, because by losing this role, they become substantially inferior compared to their man counterpart. So they lose relevance in their community, and this creates a situation of inequality. The right to land also is strictly connected to the right to health of indigenous women. Because what happens is, by taking away their lands, they often find themselves in difficult situations where they cannot access their medicinal plants, or for instance, where due to some, I don't know, some kind of activity that has been started in their territory, like a mining activities, or rather the use of chemicals in their land. This has been seen many times, that has impaired the health of indigenous women that could not access their natural resources. And also, another interesting fact is that if indigenous women were to be given back their land, that doesn't mean that they would be recognized a property right to it. This is in general true for all indigenous people. But it's particularly relevant for indigenous women, because due to some inherent patriarchal structures, often the land can only be assigned to men. So actually the Commission is trying to fight this situation, and is reminding states in many occasions that they are required to adopt, and I quote here, immediate and concrete measures to eliminate barriers that prevent women's access to economic resources and their ability to exert control over these resources. And then there's another issue related to the right to land, which is the fact that indigenous people in general, when the state they live in would like to start a development project on their lands, should be given the right to the so-called right to free, prior, and informed consultation and consent. This means that they need to be asked, they need to be informed previously to the start of any project about the idea of developing a project. And also they should be able to give consent to this project. And once again, if this is true for indigenous people in general, indigenous women suffer even here of a double discrimination, because they're not only left out of decisions because they are indigenous, but also because they're women. So they're even less likely to be consulted than the men of their community. And this is a problem that, as you can imagine, has a consequence not only on the women of the community themselves, but it also has a consequence on the community as a whole, and on the environment and the natural resources present in their land. And you can understand easily why, because as we said, indigenous women are particularly tied to their lands and are often the main defenders of their lands and the nature in their lands. And so if we don't give them the right and to give consent and be consulted on projects on their land, it's more likely that development projects that are gonna endanger the land are gonna be put forward by the country. Also, the state, according to the Commission, should ensure that there are regulations and mechanisms in place to include indigenous women in the decision, thing that doesn't happen, unfortunately, still in many countries. And by doing so, they also need to take into account the needs of indigenous women in the design of the laws and public policies. Also, the Commission has recommended that states, and I quote, take such institutional measures as may be necessary to facilitate greater political participation of indigenous women, such as increasing the capacity for coordination, and for these women and the organization representing them to promote their own specific interests, as well as to establish and strengthen opportunities for dialogue between community leaders and government. So the Commission is actually working a lot on these matters. There's been a lot of reports regarding this. The one I quoted is actually called The Road to Substantive Democracy, Women's Political Participation in the Americas. And I can also give you the link if you're interested. So what we can conclude from this is that according to the Inter-American human rights system and the Commission in particular, there's an obligation that lies on the state to avoid Indigenous women discrimination when it comes to decision on their lands. And this has to be done by ensuring that they are consulted and they have the right to give consent. And also the state have another obligation according to the Commission, that is the one to prevent further colonization and exploitation of Indigenous lands by outsiders, and to return ancestral lands and territories when these lands have been taken away without the Indigenous people having been given their consent to the lands being taken away. The right to land is also extremely tied to the right to life. And this means that what happens often when the Indigenous, like the fact that Indigenous women lose their lands, is often a threat for their own life, and always brings to some sort of situation of violence. In fact, another very important aspect of Indigenous people discrimination that has been addressed both by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in several occasions is the one of the violence against Indigenous women. There are many kinds of violence that Indigenous women are subject to, both for being women and for being Indigenous. For instance, the violence in the context of development, as we saw before, that is often connected to the expropriation of the land of Indigenous people. As noted by the Commission, in fact, many of the development projects on the land of Indigenous people trigger environmental degradation of their land, and they put the people in a situation of poverty and vulnerability that, combined with the arrival of workers and laborers in these remote areas, has often led to forced prostitution of Indigenous women, trafficking of Indigenous women and girls, violence, and other types of sexual abuse. For instance, I'll give you an example. In 2014, the Commission expressed themselves on the hearing on the human rights situation of the Apetina Indigenous community, which is a community of Suriname. And the Commission in this hearing was informed of the impacts of gold mining on the livelihood and the sustainability of Indigenous and tribal communities. And the impacts of this gold mining were several. For instance, Indigenous women reported that they were sexually abused and they were subject to violence. And also they reported to the Commission that the presence of high levels of mercury in the water that was accumulating in the fish that they were relying on for their subsistence was causing health problems in pregnant women, thus endangering once again the life of Indigenous women. Also, a very typical form of violence that Indigenous women are subject to is the violence in the context of armed conflicts or due to militarization of states' land. And I chose the second picture that you see there because those women are actually some Guatemalan women that have been victims of rape during the civil war in the 80s in Guatemala. I'll give you the example of Guatemala because it's particularly interesting in this matter and particularly sad. In fact, in Guatemala, Mayan women have been extremely discriminated during armed conflicts and have been subject to the most horrible kinds of violence. In Guatemala, the acts of violence were perpetrated in the context of a campaign to actually destroy the culture and identity of the Mayan people in general. In fact, also men have been really been subject to incredible violence. And also the majority of the rape victims during the armed conflict in Guatemala were Indigenous Mayan women, once again. And why is that? This is because Indigenous Mayan women were considered as inferior beings that didn't deserve nothing else than being violated. And in this frame, actually, there's been a lot of decisions and cases and discussion before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. there's been particularly some famous cases, and one of these is the Rio Negro massacre. The case is from 2012, but actually the massacre happened in the 80s. In this case, and here you see that once again, fortunately, you see once again the good work of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Guatemala has been held internationally responsible for the gross human rights violations committed by members of armed forces against Mayan people. But to tell you more about this case, I really also found it interesting because the violation and the violence on indigenous women in this case derive both from the civil war, but also was associated with the construction of a dam in their territory. This dam was a project that was financed by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank in Guatemala at the time. And this was really interesting because this project was put forward despite the civil war taking place in Guatemala. And the military police actually found this as an excuse to accuse the people of Rio Negro of stealing food from workers of the dam, which was a false accusation, and to massacre people and to commit rapes and kill indigenous women. These situations, unfortunately, are common also in other Latin American countries. For instance, in Colombia, there has been a lot of cases of violence in the exercise of social, economic, and political rights of indigenous women, where a lot of indigenous women have been killed or have been subject to horrible acts due to because they were human rights defenders from indigenous communities. And of course, there are other types of violence that indigenous women are subject to, like domestic violence or violence in times of displacement or migratory processes. But in general, when we talk about violence of indigenous women, the problem is also that there are in many cases, there aren't enough national laws or consequences at the national level for the violence and the discrimination of indigenous women. And this is why, according to the Commission, actually the states should intensify the efforts to document these forms of violence as a necessary part of designing and implementing effective responses. And this requires the states also to include indigenous women and their communities in this process, in this decision process, because it's important that their voices are heard when policies that are supposed to help them are actually put into place. But like this was to give you a bit of an idea of what's the situation regarding discrimination of indigenous women in particular in Latin America, and what does the Commission and so what does the human rights system do for them? But how can we impact as single individual? So a way to impact, of course, is to help indigenous people while respecting their right to self-determination. Right to self-determination means that indigenous people have the right to freely determine their political status and also to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And this means that when we help indigenous women, we also should take into account the way they want to develop socially and culturally without imposing on them our view that can be very different from the one of indigenous people as the westernized world we are. Or we can donate to and promote relevant initiatives that protect indigenous women and or their land, since we saw that the right to their land is extremely important to make sure that indigenous women are not discriminated. Or we can also find out about and support indigenous women in our community. As we saw, like indigenous women are present in more than 90 countries around the world. So it might be that in your community there are indigenous people and that you could join their battles, you could help them in their rallies, in their campaigns. And here I also put a list because I wanted to give you an idea of how we can impact and what initiatives we can support. So you can see, for instance, the FAO campaign, Indigenous Women, Visible Women, or other initiatives you can donate to or petitions that you can sign. And well, thank you very much for listening, and I'm open for questions. You can write them on the Q&A and I will try to do my best to answer. Okay, I see the first question. I was wondering whether indigenous communities traditionally have been very patriarchal, or whether the discrimination has increased internally in the indigenous communities after contact with modern societies. Actually, this is an incredibly relevant question, because the interesting thing is that indigenous communities have not traditionally been very patriarchal. There's a lot of reports that talk about the fact that indigenous communities actually haven't, in indigenous communities before colonization and before like westernization, the role of women were very much similar and very much equal to the role of men. And this is also because the women were recognized an incredibly important role in providing, as we said, the food, and they were the spiritual, most of the times they were also like the spiritual guide of the community. So actually, yes, actually indigenous communities before, after contact with modern societies became much more patriarchal. Okay, no more questions. I'll wait a little bit to see if you come up with something. In the meantime, if you want to know more about what Impactr does and other webinars, Impactr plans monthly webinars aligned with the SDG planning calendar. And in April, actually, it's the SDG of the month is good health and well-being, which I guess it's very relevant, especially for the time being. Okay, more questions. So are the men lost to the modern society, or can they go back? Okay. Well, it depends, I think. I mean, I don't know about all indigenous communities. I know that there are still some indigenous communities where men are actually still very much involved in the indigenous community life. But in general, what we see is that most of the times, the people who are really trying to battle for indigenous rights and for maintaining this traditional lifestyle is actually the women. I want to thank you for talking about this because it's very important. Thank you, Christina. I'm a woman from Guatemala, but I now live in the UK. I want to help women in relation to the protection of their knowledge for medicinal plants. How do you recommend that I start a group or start a charity? Okay, well, I've never started a charity, but I think you can, of course, still maybe try and reach out to the other, to some women maybe that come from your country, or indigenous women. There are like many forums of indigenous women also that organize conferences, for instance, in Europe. And I think like you can maybe start looking at that, or also organize some kind of online group, etc. Is lack of education also an issue, in the sense that indigenous people might not be aware of their rights and able to defend them in court? This is actually a very good question. I think that it might be, and actually in this regard of not being able to defend themselves in court, I think the main problem is the problem that most of the times indigenous people, they don't have a proper, they're not guaranteed a proper access to justice by the countries they live in. And this is also like a very important theme when we talk about discrimination of indigenous people. For instance, it's been seen in many cases that there hasn't been, like indigenous people couldn't access the courts because the courts weren't providing, the state wasn't providing a translator for them. So they couldn't understand the court judgment, or they couldn't actually really access to justice. Just to let you know that, of course, you can also become part of this Impactr community and take action. You can become an expert of Impactr like I did. And you can download the app and join the community and see all the very cool events that they organized. Okay, it seems like I don't have any more questions. No, there's a new question. Do Indigenous people accept the legal system in general? Okay. I actually don't know exactly what to answer to this question. I think they're very critical. I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I think that in many cases they've been very critical to the legal system because the legal system doesn't really recognize them and doesn't recognize their way of living. And I think this is the main clash. So there's this huge cultural clash often between the legal system of the country they live in and their actual way of life. And this is also the gap that the Inter-American Court and Commission is trying to fill by recommending states to create laws that look also at the perspective of Indigenous people and Indigenous women in general. Okay, so I think I can close this webinar now. Thank you so much. It was my first online webinar and it's been great to present this to you. I hope it was clear. And of course, if you want clarifications or if you want some of the links of the documents I used to give you this presentation or the links of the initiatives, you can of course write to Impactr and they will probably, they can send it to me and I can provide you with the link. Thank you so much.